The story doesn't end here. More is coming. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. Check out the other videos on the channel and share this one with friends who love a good mystery. Stay tuned. Morning settled over the sawmill in the unhurried way it always did, with the same blend of sharp pine scent, humming machinery, and the faint haze of wood dust hanging in the cool air. The place was never quiet, not even before the workers fully gathered. There was always some distant engine starting up, some creak of metal settling after a cold night, some loose board tapping against another. It was the kind of environment where routine became a comforting shield, and even the smallest deviation could unsettle those who relied on repetition as much as they relied on their own hands. For years, the sawmill had sat at the edge of town like an extension of its spine. Everyone knew someone who worked there. Some families had sent 3 generations through those doors. The long warehouse-like building, with its corrugated walls and sun-faded safety posters, bore the signs of time in the patches of rust and the dents accumulated from 1,000 hurried mornings. Inside, the heavy machinery looked both intimidating and familiar, held together by bolts, grease, and the experience of the men who operated it. Among those men was Igor, dressed in his usual red t-shirt beneath a flannel overshirt that he'd thrown off the moment he stepped inside, and felt the warmth of the equipment radiating through the room. At 34, he had the bearing of someone accustomed to physical work, with arms shaped by years of lifting, pushing, and steadying logs far heavier than he was. His mind, however, was anything but steady that morning. The weight of loans, the worry over his son's recurring health problems, and the simmering tension with his wife all floated beneath the surface of his thoughts. Yet none of it showed when he walked across the sawmill floor, nodding to the men around him as though it was just another day. Sergei, his usual partner on the shift, was already leaning against a stack of processed boards, sipping bitter coffee from a thermos that looked as battered as he did. A lanky man a few years younger, Sergei never managed to hide his exhaustion or his attitude. His jokes were the only thing that made him bearable on the harder days, though they tended to fray nerves when trouble appeared. He raised his eyebrows at Igor as the latter approached. "Did you hear?" Sergei said, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper, even though the sawmill was loud enough that almost nothing private could ever be overheard. "Another inspection in the forest, 3rd one this month. They say some parts might get shut down." Igor shrugged and took a sip from the paper cup he'd brought with him. "They've been saying that for years." "Yeah, but this time they mean it. Or at least that's what the loader guys said." "Loader guys say a lot of things," Igor replied, but even he felt a faint twitch of unease. Rumors of problems in the forest weren't new, yet lately they carried a different toneless gossip, more warning. The conversation ended when the foreman, a broad man with sunken eyes and a perpetual look of exhaustion, called everyone to positions. Machines were starting to warm up, their rumbling growing louder as belts tightened and pulleys spun. The familiar sense of heated metal, sawdust, and resin filled the air more intensely, settling into the workday rhythm. Igor and Sergei walked to the log intake area, where trucks brought in the raw timber from freshly cut parcels of forest. A truck had arrived earlier that morning, and its load sat stacked in an orderly row along the concrete barrier. The logs varied in diameter and length, but one in particular stood out. It was huge, thicker than most they processed, with bark that looked chipped and weathered in places. A faint curve along its side hinted at age, or perhaps at some stress the tree had endured while it still stood. The intake supervisor had already marked the logs with chalk symbols and numbers, but none of the markings said anything unusual about the one that caught Igor's attention. He paused before it, running his hand lightly over the texture of the bark. Something about it felt wrong, though he couldn't have said why. The surface was softer than he expected, almost crumbly near one end. Tiny flecks had gathered around the base, as though something had eaten away at it. He narrowed his eyes and brushed aside a loose bit of bark. Underneath, faint grooves traced in uneven patterns wound across the pale surface like miniature tunnels. Sergei, already halfway through securing another log for transport to the conveyor, turned and noticed Igor lingering. "What, you seeing ghosts in there?" he called. "It's just a log. Stop caressing it." Igor gave a dry smile. "Corroid, maybe. Looks weird." "So what? Half the logs come with something living inside. That's what the saw's for. Come on, man, we've got quotas. But as they set the log onto the conveyor, Igor couldn't shake the sensation that something about it demanded attention. Still, experience told him not to overthink. Every old tree had flaws, scars, insects, rot. The forest didn't produce perfect material. Their job was to carve usable lumber out of whatever came through the gates. Once the conveyor began to move, the heavy log rolled forward toward the primary saw. The machine itself towered above the workers like a mechanical giant, all spinning teeth and vibrating surfaces. The operator, a wiry man named Pavel, adjusted his controls while watching the log's trajectory with the focus of someone long accustomed to the danger of a moment's distraction. The sawmill's noise rose to a near-deafening pitch as machinery reacted to the incoming work. Sergei joined Igor near the operating platform. "Bet it cuts like butter," he joked over the noise, "like slicing into a birthday cake." But Igor frowned. The more he studied the log, the more that earlier sense of wrongness curled inside his stomach. He pushed it down and braced himself for the usual vibrations when the saw met wood. Instead, when the blade touched the surface, a strange sound rose above the mechanical roar. A sound so unusual it cut straight through their expectations. Instead of the firm, dense resistance of solid timber, the saw sank in with an unsettling softness, as though it were chewing through something hollow. The pitch of the blade shifted, becoming uneven and duller. Igor exchanged a glance with Sergei. Even Pavel, normally unflappable, hesitated, his hand slipping instinctively toward the emergency stop. But before he could fully pause, the internal structure of the massive log gave way. The tree appeared to collapse from within. A section near the center caved in, and then the entire length split open like a giant, decaying pod. The two halves peeled apart, revealing a vast hollow space riddled with tangled tunnels and shredded fiber. A dark, damp mass spilled forward, accompanied by a wave of pungent air that hit the men like the stench of something long dead. What poured out made several workers stumble back. The cavity was filled with writhing pale larvae of all sizes, clumped together in a churning nest. They tumbled down onto the metal surface, falling with soft, wet sounds that seemed too alive, too deliberate. Some of the creatures squirmed as they landed, others continued to writhe within the hollowed trunk, and the entire scene looked more like the inside of a corpse than the heart of a tree. Sergei let out a sharp curse and jumped backward, covering his head with his arms as though something might leap at him. Igor stood rooted to the spot, his expression frozen between disbelief and revulsion. He lifted a hand instinctively, pointing at the mass as if he needed confirmation from his own eyes that he wasn't hallucinating. The foreman came rushing over, yelling at Pavel to shut off the machine. The saw fell silent, and for a brief moment the only sounds in the sawmill were heavy breathing and the sickening rustle of larvae shifting against one another. The smell thickened in the stagnant air, filling every breath with damp decay. Someone swore loudly. Someone else gagged. A few men turned away entirely, unable to look. The foreman approached the split log, poking at the pulpy remains with a scrap of wood he picked up nearby. The tunnels inside the trunk seemed endless, weaving through what had once been a solid core, now reduced to a fragile, crumbling shell. The larvae, hundreds of them, continued to spill out, and each one that dropped to the ground added to the growing sense of contamination. "Jesus Christ," the foreman muttered, glancing around. "Who accepted this log? Did nobody even look at it?" Igor opened his mouth to answer, but no words came. He could only shake his head. The foreman didn't wait for explanations. He dashed toward the small office near the wall, shouting that he was calling the forest warden. The men nearest him stepped aside quickly, their faces pale. Everyone else instinctively maintained distance from the log, as though afraid the infestation might leap onto them or spread through their boots. Sergei, still breathing hard, edged closer to Igor. "I told you this thing looked like trouble," he said, though his voice trembled. "What the hell is all that? I've seen bugs, but not like this." Igor didn't respond immediately. His eyes were fixed on the heart of the log. He felt something colder than fear settling in his chest, a realization that he should have trusted his instinct earlier, that he should have said something before they ever placed the log onto the conveyor. But hindsight came too late. Now the mess sprawled across the floor in a grotesque display that no one could ignore. As the foreman returned, still cursing under his breath, he announced that the forest warden was on his way and that no one was allowed to touch anything until he arrived. The sawmill workers exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier jokes and complaints forgotten. The machines fell silent now, and the sudden quiet felt unnatural, as if the entire building were holding its breath. Igor wiped his palms on his jeans and noticed they were sweaty. His mind kept replaying the moment the log collapsed. He wondered how deep the infection ran into the rest of the supply, into the forest, into the livelihood of everyone who relied on this mill. But he said nothing. None of them did. They simply stood there, watching the slow movements of the larvae that continued to spread across the steel platform and onto the floor, each motion a disturbing reminder that the morning was no longer ordinary, and that the routine they all depended on had been broken in a way that might prove impossible to repair. The silence that followed the shutdown of the machinery lingered long after the last echo faded. Even with the buzzing lights overhead and the low hum of ventilation, the sawmill felt hollow, as if the lifeblood of the place had drained away with the collapse of that log. The workers kept a cautious distance from the mess, speaking in lowered voices while occasionally glancing at the clock or the entrance, as though hoping the forest warden would materialize sooner rather than later. No one dared to touch anything, and each minute seemed to stretch longer than the last. Igor remained near the platform where the log had split. Every so often his eyes drifted back to the writhing mass that had spilled out, though now most of the larvae had stopped moving or were barely twitching. The air was heavy with the sour scent of rot mingled with the oil and dust of the sawmill. There was something profoundly unsettling about the sight. The idea that what appeared solid and reliable could be eaten away from within until it was nothing but a fragile shell. It felt like a quiet metaphor for too many things in his life. He tried to occupy his mind by inspecting his gloves or adjusting his tools, but nothing helped. The image of the log hollowed out by unseen parasites kept returning, each time with a sharper edge. Sergei had gone uncharacteristically quiet since the initial shock. He leaned against a support beam, arms crossed tightly over his chest, occasionally rubbing at the back of his neck or kicking at stray sawdust. His earlier bravado had vanished entirely. When the warden finally arrived, it was without ceremony. The front gate clanged open, and the familiar boxy vehicle rolled in, rattling along the uneven pavement. The truck stopped abruptly near the entrance of the sawmill. The door swung open, and out stepped a man who carried the weight of the forest in his posture. His uniform, though faded and slightly frayed at the edges, gave him an air of authority, and the deep lines etched into his face suggested that he'd seen more than enough to know trouble when he met it. He strode across the floor without hesitation, surveying the scene with a practiced eye. The workers parted instinctively, giving him a clear path to the dissected log. When he came to stand beside it, he paused, leaning forward slightly to examine the gaping cavity. His expression darkened. Without touching anything, he squatted to get a closer look, narrowing his eyes as he traced the pattern of erosion and the clusters of larvae. "Who accepted this delivery?" he asked without looking up. The foreman stepped forward, wiping his hands nervously on the sides of his pants. "It came in with the morning load. Everything looked normal from the outside. We didn't think, well, we've never had something like this before." The warden rose to his full height and fixed the foreman with a stern look. "You don't need to think. You need to inspect. Rotten bark doesn't always mean a bad tree. But this isn't something that happens overnight. This log was infested months ago, maybe longer." He shifted his gaze to the others, including Igor and Sergei. "Did any of you notice anything unusual about this one before it was loaded?" Igor hesitated. There was a prickling sensation at the back of his neck, as though the truth wanted to rise to his lips, but shame kept it pinned down. He remembered brushing his hand along the bark, the softness, the odd grooves beneath the surface. He remembered thinking it looked wrong, and then ignoring the feeling because they had a quota to meet and no one wanted delays. The foreman looked back and forth between them expectantly. Sergei glanced at Igor, waiting. Igor almost spoke, but stopped himself. Admitting he'd noticed something might attract blame, might lead to questions no one wanted, and yet the warden's sharp eyes suggested he already suspected the truth. "We didn't see anything out of the ordinary," Sergei said quickly, breaking the silence before it stretched too long. Just another log. The warden studied them a moment longer, then sighed heavily. No, it wasn't just another log. This is from the restricted zone. The marks are clear. He pointed to the remnants of a painted number near the base, barely visible beneath the crumbling bark. This was cut from a sector that's been under observation for an infestation. I've been filing reports about it for months. A murmur ran through the workers. A restricted zone meant stricter controls, mandatory inspections, and absolutely no shipments out until cleared. If a log from that area had arrived here, something had gone very wrong. The foreman frowned, his face reddening. Why wasn't the sawmill told about this? We should have been warned. You were, the warden replied flatly, or at least the management was. Whether that information reached everyone else is another matter entirely. At that moment, the sawmill's owner appeared, his arrival marked by the sound of hurried footsteps on the metal stairs that led from the office. A broad-shouldered man in a wrinkled button-up shirt, he looked irritated rather than shocked. He approached the group with an air of annoyance. What's going on? Why are all the machines shut down? He demanded, though the words faltered when he saw the open log and the infestation spilling from it. What in God's name happened? The warden explained the situation succinctly, describing the infestation, the origin of the log, and the consequences of using wood from a restricted zone. The owner listened with growing disbelief and frustration, running his thumb across the edge of his belt as though trying to process the scale of the problem. This is a disaster, he muttered. We've got deadlines, contracts. We can't afford to lose a shipment, let alone shut down operations. This isn't optional, the warden said. You have a contamination incident. That means immediate containment and an inspection of every log that came from the same supplier. The owner clenched his jaw but said nothing more. The warden turned back to the foreman. I'm calling the Regional Forestry Service. They'll send a team to assess the extent of the contamination here and to determine how much of your supply is affected. Until they arrive, no one is to move this log. No one is to start any machinery. Understood? The foreman nodded quickly. Several workers exchanged worried looks, and the atmosphere in the sawmill grew heavier by the minute. The mere mention of a regional team carried implications of formal investigations, inspections, and possibly fines or shutdowns that could ripple through the entire town. The warden stepped away from the split log and gestured for the foreman and several workers, among them Igor, to join him. We need to check your storage areas, he said. If this log came from an infested batch, the others might show early signs, even if not as advanced as this one. Together they moved toward the storage yard at the back of the sawmill, where stacks of logs were arranged in long rows beneath a wide metal canopy. The farther they walked from the open cavity of the split log, the more normal everything appeared. Sunlight filtered through thin clouds and cast a pale glow over the stacks, giving the yard the illusion of order and stability. But as they approached the nearer rows, the warden slowed his steps. He studied the logs intently, running his hand along the bark, knocking on the trunks, checking for certain sounds. Occasionally, he bent down to examine where small piles of fine powder had collected. It was the telltale sign left behind by insects as they ate their way through the inner layers. This one here, he said, indicating a thick log with faint cracks along its surface. See that powder? If it's fresh, it means something's active inside. Hard to say how serious it is, but it's not normal. Igor looked closer, kneeling to touch the powder. It was incredibly fine, almost like flour, except its texture had a granular dryness. When he pressed it between his fingers, it crumbled into dust. He felt a chill run prickling along his back. We need to quarantine this whole section, the warden declared. And these 3 rows, he added, pointing at areas where bark had peeled in, ways that suggested interior damage. The foreman swallowed hard. That's nearly a third of our stock for the month. Nekaramaim. When larvae are involved, it only takes one bad shipment to ruin everything, the warden answered. If it spreads, you'll be dealing with far more than a few lost logs. You could end up with the whole mill shut down, and the forest around here in even worse shape. The implication struck Igor more deeply than he'd expected. The forest wasn't simply a resource. It was woven into their identity, their history, even their sense of belonging. The idea that something was quietly destroying it made him feel strangely betrayed. They continued inspecting log after log. Some were clean, Others showed minor signs, but nothing to the degree of the one that had torn open on the platform. Still, the warden took notes on each suspicious log and instructed the foreman to mark them with bright paint. By the time they finished, a sense of dread had settled over the group. The contamination wasn't catastrophic yet, but it was spreading. No one could claim ignorance anymore. As they headed back toward the sawmill, the warden paused near the entrance. His face was more serious now than it had been earlier, and his voice carried the weight of warning. "This isn't just a log problem," he said quietly, glancing between Igor, Sergei, and the foreman. "This is a forest problem. If trees in that sector are this badly infested, the damage has been building silently for a long time. The supplier should never have cut from that zone, let alone ship the wood here. It's negligence at best, fraud at worst." Igor exchanged a look with Sergei. There was something in the warden's tone that suggested he feared something bigger was coming, something none of them were prepared to handle. A few minutes later, the regional forestry team arrived. Their truck was emblazoned with official markings, and the people who stepped out wore protective gear. They approached the sawmill briskly, carrying equipment meant for testing and containment. Their leader introduced himself and quickly began surveying the area, his expression tightening as he viewed the infestation firsthand. The workers gathered at a cautious distance, watching as samples were taken, photographs were snapped, and notes were written down in methodical strokes. Every action by the officials seemed to underscore the severity of the situation. The machines, once roaring and clattering with life, now stood silent like dormant beasts awaiting judgment. The owner paced near the office, muttering under his breath and occasionally running a hand through his thinning hair. Each time one of the officials glanced in his direction, he stiffened as though bracing for a blow. Eventually, the forestry team formed a small circle with the warden and the owner. Their conversation was subdued but intense. The owner's face shifted from defensive anger to resignation as the officials outlined the preliminary findings. The infestation was real. It likely originated from the restricted zone, and the sawmill's operation would be partially suspended until the full scope of contamination was determined. When the officials finally dispersed to begin the next stage of their inspection, the owner turned to the workers. His voice trembled with barely controlled frustration. "We'll be reducing activity for the next few days," he said. "Possibly longer. I know this affects all of you, but we have no choice." He paused as though wanting to say more, then simply waved them off. The weight of leadership seemed to press down on him harder than ever. The workers trickled away in groups, their conversations hushed and filled with speculation. Some were angry, others worried, and a few simply tired. For many of them, the mill was their livelihood. Any disruption, especially one tied to something beyond their control, felt like a threat to their stability. Igor remained near the platform long after most of the men left. He stared at the hollowed-out log, now partially cordoned off with caution tape. The larvae had mostly stopped moving, but the damage they had caused was unmistakable. He imagined the forest where the tree had once stood, imagined a whole grove filled with trunks rotting from within. The thought made his chest tighten. Sergei joined him, leaning against the metal railing. "Never seen anything like this," he said softly. "Feels wrong, like the forest is sick." "It probably is," Igor replied, "and someone cut from the wrong place anyway." Sergei sighed and rubbed his face with both hands. "If they shut us down for good—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The fear hung between them. Igor understood. The future felt uncertain, and uncertainty bred questions that no one could yet answer. But beneath that anxiety was something else, a growing determination to understand how everything had gone so wrong. He wanted to know who had sent that infested log through. Whether it was incompetence or greed, he wanted the truth. As he stepped away from the platform, he cast one more glance at the exposed cavity. The rot inside was deeper than it appeared, and its reach was spreading. And though none of them wanted to admit it, the worst was likely still ahead. The inspectors' voices continued in the distance, and the sawmill felt smaller with each step Igor took. The machinery stood silent, awaiting a future that had grown uncertain in the span of a single morning, and the forest warden's earlier words echoed through Igor's mind with a cold clarity. This wasn't the end of a problem. It was the beginning, The remainder of the day passed under a shadow that none of the workers could shake. The sawmill, normally humming with noise and activity, now felt stripped of its purpose. Machines that had always seemed unstoppable stood still, their silence pressing against the men like a physical weight. The thick smell of fuel and sawdust lingered in the air, but without the usual motion and clatter, even that scent felt out of place. A reminder of something that was supposed to be alive and wasn't. As the regional forestry team continued to examine the infested log under bright portable lamps, workers kept their distance, glancing over their shoulders as though afraid the rot would spread simply by being watched. Igor found himself among them, unable to leave even though his shift had technically ended hours earlier. He felt tethered to the mess in front of him, as though something in that hollowed-out trunk demanded to be faced rather than ignored. The others were similarly unsettled. A few had gone home early, shaking their heads in disbelief. Some lingered near the entrance, forming small groups where they spoke in voices tinged with worry and frustration. A handful tried to distract themselves with odd maintenance tasks or sweeping, but even these gestures felt half-hearted. No one wanted to be fully still, yet no one wanted to be near the logs either. When the officials finally stepped aside to compare notes, Igor approached the foreman, who had been pacing restlessly between the office and the cordoned-off platform. The man's face looked older than usual, his brow creased and his jaw locked tight, as if bracing for a blow. They exchanged a few quiet words, nothing profound. Neither of them had the right language for describing what had happened, but enough to acknowledge that the day had shaken them both. As the evening deepened, some of the workers began drifting away. The foreman eventually told everyone to head home. Nothing more would happen tonight. The regional team seemed prepared to work well into the night, but they didn't need extra bodies in the way. The owner had retreated to his office, where he remained behind a closed door, making calls that sounded increasingly tense. Igor stood in the yard staring out at the stacks of logs darkening with the fading light. The forest lay beyond the hills, invisible in the dusk, yet present in every thought. He knew he should head home. His wife would be waiting, and their son always asked for him before bed. But instead he lingered, trying to make sense of the unease that had rooted itself inside him. Only when the yard lights flickered on and the air grew sharply colder did he finally turn toward his car. The next morning the sawmill felt different still. Rumors had traveled fast through town. Outside the gates, a few curious locals lingered with hands tucked into jacket pockets, trying to get a glimpse of the logs that had caused such a commotion. Inside, the workers arrived slowly, some earlier than usual, others dragging their feet. No one knew what to expect from the day ahead. The machines remained silent, still bound by the warden's order. The hollowed log stood at the center of the activity once again, though now it had been outlined with chalk, photographed repeatedly, and partly covered with protective sheeting. The larvae that had spilled out had been gathered or removed by the forestry team, though their absence left behind an impression just as disturbing. Memories of things that had wriggled and pulsed where no life should have been. The regional team had returned early, their vehicles pulling up with a deliberate slowness. They spoke quietly among themselves before calling the owner over. The tension between them was impossible to miss. Even without hearing their words, the workers could read the owner's expressions easily. Disbelief, anger, then something that looked like reluctant acceptance. When he finally gathered everyone, his announcement confirmed the worst fears. "We're partially shut down," he said, voice hoarse, "until further notice." A wave of dismay rippled through the group. Some swore under their breath. Others stared blankly at the ground. A few men shuffled uneasily, calculating what this would mean for their paychecks, their mortgages, their families. The owner continued, but the words blurred under the weight of the tension. Inspections, limited tasks, cooperation with the forestry service, compliance with containment measures. None of it sounded like reassurance. When he finished, the crowd dispersed in broken clusters. The men headed to familiar corners of the yard or the break room, trying to process the news. The foreman approached Igor and Sergei, motioning for them to join him. "We need to review the paperwork from the last shipments," he said. "Management needs help verifying which logs came from where." Sergei rolled his eyes. "Let me guess. Because they already lost track?" The foreman didn't smile. "Because no one wants to be blamed. and the region will want answers. They made their way toward the office. Inside, stacks of documents covered the desk's delivery manifests, supplier forms, inspection sheets that suddenly seemed laughably inadequate. The foreman spread out several pages bearing stamps from the supplier responsible for the contaminated batch. Igor stared at the printed numbers, trying to decipher the codes indicating origin, date, and quality. According to the paperwork, the logs were from a sector labeled as compliant and healthy. There was no mention of restriction, no hint that the area had been flagged for infestation. "These can't be right," Igor said. "The warden said this zone was under observation." "And yet the forms say otherwise," the foreman replied grimly. "Someone either falsified these or ignored the restrictions." He looked directly at Igor. "Which means we're dealing with more than just bugs." They continued sifting through the paperwork. The room fell into a rhythm of rustling pages, clicking pens, and heavy sighs. The more they examined, the more inconsistencies they found. Dates that didn't match, stamps that seemed out of place, missing signatures. Whoever had handled the logs on the supplier's end had either been careless or deliberately deceptive. The idea that someone might knowingly send potentially infested logs into the supply chain made Igor's stomach knot tighter. By midday, the forestry officials asked for a meeting with the owner and the foreman. The workers weren't invited, but the tone of the conversation through the thin office walls carried clearly enough. Questions, accusations, the sound of shifting chairs, rising voices, the snap of a clipboard. When the meeting ended, the owner remained seated, head in his hands. The foreman emerged first, his expression bleak. He approached Igor quietly. "They're opening a formal investigation," he said. "About the supplier, about us, about everything." "Us?" Igor asked, surprised. "What did we do?" "Not us personally," the foreman clarified, though his voice was tight. "The mill. They want to make sure we weren't complicit." "But we didn't know anything," Sergei protested. "We just cut the damn logs." "That doesn't matter when bureaucracy gets involved," the foreman replied. "They have to cover every angle." Igor felt a surge of frustration, though not directed at the foreman. They were all being pulled into something far bigger and more tangled than any of them had anticipated. What had begun as a strange log had grown into an event capable of shaking the foundation of their livelihoods. As the hours wore on, the forestry team continued their work. They moved toward the storage yard again, this time bringing more sophisticated equipment. They drilled samples from several logs, collected debris, and recorded observations with clinical precision. Their solemn demeanor said more than their words ever could. Igor and Sergei watched from a distance. "You think this will get better anytime soon?" Sergei asked quietly. "Or is this just the start?" Igor exhaled slowly. "Feels like the start." The warden approached moments later, hands tucked behind his back. His face was stern but not unkind. He nodded toward the contaminated log. "We finished the preliminary assessment. The infestation is significant, and based on what we've seen in your yard, it's spread farther than anyone realized." "So what happens now?" Igor asked. "Now," the warden replied, "we go back into the forest." He looked at Igor more directly. "And I want you to come with me tomorrow." Igor blinked. "Me? You were the first to handle that log. You saw the bark, you noticed the texture, and you understand the machinery and the signs. I need someone from the mill who knows how these trees are processed. Someone who can help me identify what's normal and what isn't." Sergei let out a low whistle. "Lucky you." But beneath the teasing was something like fear. The forest, normally a place of work and familiarity, now seemed darker in their imagination, more dangerous in its decay. Igor nodded slowly. "I'll come." "Good," the warden said. "We leave before dawn." The rest of the day passed in a haze of waiting for updates, waiting for news, waiting for clarity that never came. The workers drifted around the sawmill in a fog of uncertainty, unsure which tasks they were allowed to do and which ones might violate containment rules. The break room was unusually quiet, save for the occasional scrape of chair legs or the hiss of the ancient coffee machine. Outside, the wind picked up. It swept across the yard, rustling loose bark and stirring small clouds of sawdust. The logs stood in their neat stacks, but now each seemed suspicious, as though hiding secrets beneath the rough outer skin. Igor eventually clocked out and walked toward his car, with slow, measured steps. Sergei caught up briefly, clapping him on the shoulder. "Be careful tomorrow," he said, half joking, half serious. "If you see anything moving in those trees, don't try to pet it." Igor managed a weak smile. "I'll keep that in mind." When he finally drove home, the sky had turned a soft, bruised shade of purple. The town felt subdued, as if it too sensed the shift. Lights glowed in windows. Families gathered around dinner tables. Life went on, but the sawmill sickness, the forest sickness, hung over everything like a low cloud. At home, Igor struggled to explain the situation to his wife. He downplayed the infestation but couldn't hide the shutdown or the trip he'd agreed to take with the warden. She listened quietly, worry etched into her expression, yet she didn't try to stop him. "If it's something serious," she said softly, "then someone has to help figure it out." He nodded, grateful for her trust, even as fear gnawed at him. That night he barely slept. The image of the hollow log replayed endlessly in his mind. The tunnels, the larvae, the rot that had eaten away everything strong and solid. He wondered how many trees in the forest were like that now, how long it had been growing, and what else they would find when they stepped into the infested sector. Before dawn had fully risen, he was already awake and pulling on his boots. The morning air outside was cold enough to sting his lungs, and frost clung to the grass in delicate patterns. The warden's truck waited at the end of the street, its headlights cutting through the dark. As Igor climbed inside, he cast one last look at his quiet house, where a faint light glowed in the kitchen window. Then he closed the door and the truck pulled forward. The engine's rumble grew steady as they headed toward the forest. For a moment, the road seemed endless, stretching into a world where trees stood like dark silhouettes against the pale horizon. The farther they drove, the more Igor felt the weight of responsibility settle over him. The sawmill had problems, yes, but the forest might be dying from the inside out. The warden did not speak for a long time. The silence in the cab was broken only by the sound of tires crunching over gravel. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. "If this log made it to your mill," he said, "if it slipped through every checkpoint, every warning, every restriction, then what we're about to see out there isn't the worst of it. It's only the beginning." Igor stared ahead, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, the dark trees rising like shadows as the truck carried them deeper into the unknown. He knew then that everything had changed. The sawmill, the town, the forest, and himself. The rot had been revealed, and its reach was far greater than any of them had feared. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next episodes. Check out my other videos as well. There's plenty more to explore. And if you found this interesting, share it with someone who might enjoy it too. Thanks for watching.